Michael. All right, we have everybody here, so we'll convene our regular meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission for Tuesday, March 22nd at 6:30. Thanks to everybody on the commission for joining us, and thanks for our guests for being here as well. First item on our agenda is the agenda. Any changes?
I don't have any to offer.
Okay, then our agenda is as it stands. Anyone from the commission? Okay.
Can we talk about short-term rentals again? Are we going to have to?
We may hear a little bit about that from the director's report.
Okay.
We'll see. Item 2 is a public forum. Megan, do we have people for the public forum tonight?
We do. I am going to start with the folks who reached out to me before the meeting. So if anybody else would like to speak during the public forum, you can use the raise hand function and we'll get to you as well. We will start with Kelly Devine.
Kelly,
Hello.
welcome.
Thank you, Megan. My name is Kelly Devine. I am, some of you know me, but I'm the executive director of the Burlington Business Association. We've been working and sometimes directly with this group on housing policy for the city for several years. I know that we have a housing crisis that is, important and needs to be addressed. I leave up front, our organization is concerned about the swiftness of this current proposal to place the shelter pod village somewhere in Burlington. I guess, before we even had a chance to weigh in, it was decided that it was going to go in Elmwood Avenue, and the city council supported that vote last night. That felt very, very rushed, very little, no opportunity for input whatsoever on the location from, stakeholders, people who live nearby. And so given the experience most recently of that makes me very concerned about this proposed interim emergency shelter zoning change regulation that CEDO is putting forward. Because as someone who felt sort of surprised and taken off guard by this most recent process, I can empathize with folks who would be put through a similar process if this change were to be approved. I also would say that, yes, I understand that we have a housing crisis. We have a housing crisis on a bunch of different levels. And, I have watched many projects go through the pains of the approval process, the permitting process, and review processes to get approved. And we've ended up with some really good projects. I actually serve on the planning commission in the town where I live. And we formerly did design review work. So I understand what value can come from those kinds of processes. And so I would say to the planning commission, either A, we're in such a housing crisis that we should provide this level of expedited approval to all forms of housing that are getting built, or B, don't do it at all. I don't really understand why this one single housing type is being given preferential treatment in the process, especially given that this type of housing isn't tested. They have done some in other cities, but they're all relatively new. I haven't been able to find a single report anywhere that is, 2 years later, here's what we've learned. So this type of housing is not tested. There is a lot of city land there. As I'm sure many of you know, Burlington has a vast amount of green space and public land. My mind can go to some crazy places, but we're putting this on Waterfront Park, we're putting it in the North 40, are we putting it, additional ones, in Roosevelt Park, in other neighborhoods. And if any of you tuned into city council last night, we heard from some really concerned residents who felt like, wow, this is in my neighborhood and I didn't even know about it. And I didn't even get a chance to speak out about it. And I have concerns about it. So I'm really speaking on behalf of our 250 members, not in favor of this expedited approval process for emergency shelters. Thank you.
Thank you. Megan? Anyone
Okay.
else?
Yes, we have Sharon Busher.
Sharon, welcome.
Yes, hi, good evening. I'm also going to be speaking about the interim emergency shelter proposal you have before you. I read through it and I was glad to see that in that draft, there was a statement about meeting with stakeholders or the neighborhood before the implementation. I had spoke about this at your last meeting, that I felt that this could have really bad consequences. And I think that kind of spilled out at the city council meeting last night. I was listening to that meeting also, and appreciated how unprepared some people were for what was being put forward and actually what got approved last night. But I'm calling you also about another piece of this proposed ordinance that I'm really respectfully asking you to pay attention to. And it's in table 5.4.13. I did put this to text for Megan, so she does have what I'm going to say. But so in the interim shelter pod, it says duration beyond 3 years must meet requirements of permanent facility. And so then that seems fine. But what is missing is the fact that a lesson learned through the DRB process and I've mentioned this before, but I want to restate it, with Mod B, a building up at the hospital. It was approved as a temporary structure. And then they came forward and extended that permit, and finally they came forward just recently to get it to be a permanent structure. Now, I have no problem with that, but what concerned me was who inspected it to ensure that a temporary structure now was built for the durability of a permanent structure. And what I learned, and Mary O'Neill helped me with this, was that inspection services only inspects a structure, like a temporary structure or an interim structure, at that time that it's being put forward. But if it transitions to permanent, there is no requirement to go back and re-inspect. And I feel like that's a real safety loophole that I feel the city should pay attention to. I don't think it's a really big amendment, but I feel it should be stated that in order to make sure that the structures that we have that are inhabited by people, especially these, are safe, that they need to be re-inspected before they become permanent. And so I really wanted to focus my attention on that. So thank you so much, and I hope you'll consider my concern.
Great, thank you.
Okay, again, if anybody that just joined is interested in speaking during public forum, you can use the raise hand. We'll go next to Martha Lang.
Hello, good evening.
Hey, Martha.
Thank you. Good evening. Nice to see you, Andy, and you, Bruce. Thank you for your time and consideration. I'm here to talk about the BHS rezoning. I sent in information 2 weeks ago, but I couldn't make the meeting. A new high school is essential to the future prosperity of the city of Burlington. And thank you, Scott, for clarifying that the natural resource protected overlay district is not included. However, there are issues and restrictions on that overlay district. My main concern is that you're suggesting that buildings could be 80 feet high within this property line. I don't know any place in Burlington where the buildings are 80 feet. And one of the property lines you can build up to within 10 feet of a property line. I happen to live in an institutional zone, and I'm very familiar with how it happened in the length of time. In order to have an overlay district in an institutional zone, that is granting the institutions higher building heights and more lot coverage. The institutions had to give back to the neighborhood a buffer zone. Hospital Hill on Colchester Avenue is a buffer zone. All along East Avenue is a buffer zone. So if you're going to grant BHS building heights of 80 feet within 10 feet of a property line, they need to give back a buffer zone. And I caution you that this is a major zoning change and we need to go slowly. And just, I hope, Megan, I'm sure that you gave them that typed sheet that I sent to you. My main concern at this point are numbers 9, 10, and 11. So I support a strong high school. It's essential to the future of Burlington, but a rezone needs to be taken very slowly and with consideration. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, I appreciate all your hard work, you people. It's good to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martha.
Next, we have Jeff Nick.
Good evening, Jeff.
Good evening. Hi, everybody. Thanks for letting me speak. As you know, I'm chair of the Church Street Marketplace Commission, and I did send out an email a few days ago. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that. Specifically about this one particular site for the pods on Elmwood Avenue. The Church Street Marketplace Commission had a lengthy discussion about this. We're certainly sympathetic to the situation. However, we voted 9-0 to oppose this particular location for a number of reasons, but most importantly, the unintended consequences of the bad behaviors that could certainly end up on the marketplace. And we as a community really haven't figured out a way to stop these bad behaviors. That really isn't a good way and any meaningful consequences to move these people along once they start drinking and doing everything else. And I think some of you are aware of what goes on down here sometimes. But more importantly, the Plan BTV, and maybe others have spoken about this already, but Plan BTV, and many of us here worked on this, calls out the fact that this is not a good location. Just reading from Plan BTV, if I can, the mayor's letter in here states that Plan BTV is your vision of a more vibrant downtown and waterfront, and Plan BTV sets a clear vision. So in Plan BTV, on page 53, it talks about the high concentration of nonprofit and government organizations delivering services. And it goes on to say, such high concentrations of social service providers can become easily unmanageable if stakeholders are not working together, keeping an eye on some of the larger interactions and their implications. For example, downtown is arguably not the best environment for people recovering from alcohol and drug addiction. So I think that's what this is telling us, is that particular location is not right. But more importantly, there needs to be dialogue and a process before approving anything in the city. That's what this speaks to. And I hope you take that into consideration. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, next we have Evan.
Good evening, Evan.
Hi, my name is Evan Langfelt. I'm the president and CEO of O'Brien Brothers. We own the property at 43 Elmwood Avenue. It's a 41 unit, extremely low income and very low income residences of both elderly, disabled, and also families. And this proposal first came to light to my attention just this past week. I did participate on the Zoom call that took place last week that the city held, but I have concerns specifically about that specific property and the adjacencies, the folks that are living there that don't really have an opportunity to necessarily move elsewhere because of what's going on, what could potentially go on this site. So there's a concern there with the safety, the health, and the environment of what could take place immediately next door, and the ability or the inability of folks that are living in those low income and very low income situations to be able to relocate as a result of it. But more, or just as importantly, I have concerns about the circumventing of a typical planning process. We're a real estate developer, we're a real estate manager. I'm well accustomed to going through a permitting process. We're on the tail end of completing a 24-month process for both a market rate project as well as 74 units of low income housing in South Burlington. And I'll be the first person to tell you that it's not always a fun process going through the planning process and permitting process, but it is a collaborative one. It does engage neighbors, and it brings a lot of things to light. And the point of it, obviously, as you guys well know, is that you end up with a better project because there is push and pull on each side. And my concern here is that this is circumventing that process by kind of fast forwarding and going around the typical permitting process. So again, I appreciate that there is a need here. I'm not by any means putting my head in the sand and saying that there isn't a strong need for this, but I think, as Kelly pointed out, there's a need for housing of all natures in the city of Burlington, including affordable housing, which is what we have, which is immediately next door, and we have concerns about our residents that are there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that looks like everyone for now. So we can move on, Andy.
Okay, we'll close the public forum, and the next item is the chair's report. I don't have anything to report tonight, but we'll move on to the director's report. Item 4, Megan.
All right, I have just 2 things to share tonight. The first is really exciting. You may have noticed a new face on the screen this evening, Charles Dillard. Charles joined us last Monday, actually, as our new principal planner here in the department, and has been diving in and getting to know more about Burlington and the work that we're doing here in Burlington in a wide variety of ways. So I'm really excited to welcome Charles. I know that he is also, I won't speak for him, but I think he's also really excited to be joining us here in Burlington. And I'll turn it over to him and let him give you a little bit of an introduction to who he is.
Thanks, Megan. Indeed, I am very excited to be principal planner for Burlington and to be soon moving up to Burlington. So I'm currently in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I've been living and working for the last 7 years as a planner and urban designer. I'm originally from North Carolina, Winston-Salem, and I have to say, Commissioner Baker, it looks like we have to wait for it.
Charles, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you, actually.
Oh, is that any better?
Yeah, when you're looking directly at the computer, it's better.
Okay, well, sorry about that. So yes, originally from North Carolina, got a master's in planning from UNC, and a master's in landscape architecture from the University of Toronto, and subsequently moved to New York City, where I worked in planning for the city of New York, working on some projects that I think have some similarities with some of the work going on in Burlington, specifically waterfront projects, formerly industrial areas, some still industrial areas, and sort of managing the relationship between sometimes conflicting uses. And had a great 3 years in New York, did a whole range of work, returned to North Carolina, where the last 7 years I've spent 5 years with the city of Raleigh and a couple years in consulting, doing a whole range of projects, housing included. I've been the city of Raleigh's point person on missing middle housing and accessory dwelling units and some other things, and also helping to manage pretty unprecedented growth in the city of Raleigh. And I know that, I know personally firsthand that, the housing situation in Burlington is very difficult for everybody across income spectrums, and looking forward to being part of the team and to meeting you all and getting some really great work done. I'll just finish by saying that, specifically wanted to move to a community like Burlington. Burlington is obviously a very special place. And I look forward to continuing that good work that I think Megan has set a precedent for. And yeah, like I said, really looking forward to meeting everybody in person soon as I can.
Great. Well, welcome, Charles. We're really excited to have you joining us and look forward to you coming up to Burlington.
Thanks.
Yeah, we managed not to scare Charles off. He came to visit Burlington after we offered him the job in February. And if you may remember, there was a weekend where it was like 40 and seemed like it should be sunny and nice, but all the snow melted and we were just left with gritty ice everywhere. And then the next morning it was 8 degrees. So he got a flavor of what this time of year in Vermont is really like. So he came back.
Good.
Does
Good to see
anybody
you.
have any questions for Charles? All right, great. Well, we're looking forward to having him jump in more to the work that we're doing, and you'll see him at our meetings on a regular basis. So the other quick update I have for you tonight is Alex asked about short-term rentals. I'm sure you all have seen the news this morning that last night the city council did not overturn the mayor's veto of the short-term rental ordinance. So what that means is that we currently have or will be working with our existing bed and breakfast and hotel standards for short-term rentals for the time being. There was a lot of discussion at the meeting last night, and I think there's an interest in still continuing to try to move forward and bring back some part of the short-term rental ordinance. I think a lot of the kind of tension is around a pretty narrow set of issues as it relates to short-term rentals and what can happen specifically on owner-occupied properties. So I would expect that probably shortly after a new council is seated and begins working together, that we may see something come back again. So the piece that you may remember that the Planning Commission worked on, or there were two pieces that you worked on related to short-term rentals. There was both the changes to our minimum housing requirements, which is where the bulk of the regulations that we spent time on were located, and then a piece that kind of enabled them through zoning. I think ultimately, if the council decides to move forward again, the piece in zoning will come back to you. That has expired. You're all familiar with how zoning amendments expire after a year. So that piece will likely come back to you in order to support that work. And actually, as I say that, I forgot there's one other thing that I did want to share with you, which is last night the council also talked about the minimum parking amendment that you worked on for the council ordinance committee. After you referred the ordinance back to the ordinance committee, they had 2 meetings where they discussed your feedback that you had shared with them. I think I mentioned to you before that they accepted the vast majority of the changes that you had sent on to them. There were a couple of exceptions. Ultimately, they did recommend including an expansion of the TDM requirements, but they heard the feedback about the fact that some of those standards may not be appropriate in neighborhood and shared use parking districts, and made some tweaks to how the TDM standards would apply in other parts of the city. So ultimately, the council last night voted to recommend that kind of move forward through its formal zoning amendment process, which means that you will see that at one of your upcoming meetings for you to hold a public hearing and accept comment and refer to them with the statutory report that accompanies all zoning amendments. So we'll see that in the near term.
Good, thank you. Anything else? You all set?
I'm all set.
Perfect. Then we'll move on to item 5, which is proposed CDO amendment for interim emergency shelters.
All right, and Samantha Dunn, and actually, I think, sorry, one second, that Brian Pine also joined, so I will add him in here in case he would like to join. At your last meeting, we introduced this discussion related to creating 2 categories for emergency shelters within our zoning standards. The two categories include permanent facilities, which maintain all of our existing standards related to emergency shelters within the city, where they're located, how they're permitted, and all of the other applicable standards. The other category was to introduce an interim facility, an interim emergency shelter facility, really intended to address the types of facilities that are not meant to be permanent, that are meant to be deployed quickly and maybe not even constructed as a full facility in the sense that we would imagine a permanent emergency shelter. So this addressed the standards for where these would be located, what types of sites would be eligible to be used for them, the density of guests that would be able to occupy a temporary facility, duration of stay, and details around the management of these sites. In the conversation last week, there were two major questions or concerns that really emerged from the discussion. The first was about how we make sure that neighborhood residents are informed about the potential for the location of an interim facility. Under the current standards for emergency facilities, emergency shelters are considered to be a conditional use, which does not always require them to hold a pre-application neighborhood meeting, which is something that we heard from some of the commenters and that we talked about quite a bit, but would always require that there is a public hearing that would be held by the DRB when an application is submitted. When we talked about the standards associated with a temporary facility, we talked about the potential for these to be considered on a more administrative basis. So not requiring a conditional use review by the DRB, which wouldn't require a public hearing. So there was an interest in circling back on this issue and making sure that there was still some kind of neighborhood notice before an application is submitted. So on page 3 of the ordinance language that you have, you'll see that we've added a section that talks about requiring a pre-application neighborhood meeting. So this would be a new standard that does not apply to permanent emergency shelters today. And the purpose of that, typically those pre-application neighborhood meetings are held anytime somebody is creating more than 5 dwelling units or 10,000 square feet of new development anywhere in the city. So that is the kind of notification standard that was introduced here since you saw this last.
Emily?
How does this, you mentioned permanent emergency shelters. How does this process differ from the process of a permanent emergency shelter? Because it sounds like, from what I'm understanding, if the zone allows for a permanent emergency shelter, then it doesn't go to DRB and there's not a neighborhood notice. So I'm wondering why this should be different in that it's you'd think that it actually would be more lenient because it's temporary, whereas if the process to create a permanent shelter doesn't require this, why are we requiring it for a temporary shelter?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me go back to kind of what it means to have a public hearing in front of the DRB. So for a permanent emergency shelter under our standards today, emergency shelters are considered a conditional use in all of the zoning districts in which they are allowed. So generally in all of our mixed use and residential zoning districts. As a conditional use, it's not required to meet the kind of pre-application neighborhood meeting, but it is required to go through a public hearing process at the Development Review Board. And so that does include certain kind of neighboring property notifications and other postings to make people aware of the public hearing and provide an opportunity for people to be able to participate in that public hearing. But it's actually at the time of application and review by the Development Review Board that public hearing, that public meeting happens. So in the case of proposing alternate standards for an interim facility, for a temporary facility, the idea would be that instead of applying for a conditional use permit that would go before the DRB, the application could be reviewed administratively by the administrative officer. But instead of requiring a full-blown public hearing in front of the DRB, this pre-application neighborhood meeting would offer an opportunity for somebody who's proposing to introduce a temporary facility to talk with the neighbors, to make sure they're informed, to take their feedback and use that before they actually apply for a permit with the city. So that's how the two processes would differ.
So with the DRB hearing, the permanent shelter actually has to pass through the DRB and get a vote. And so that's the difference, is that this, you're creating a forum for the neighborhood to be heard, but they don't have to get a winning vote in the DRB to become a temporary shelter. Is that right?
That's correct. They would have to meet all of the standards that are outlined here for a temporary shelter, but that passing vote would essentially be a review by the administrative staff that issues zoning permits.
And I guess sorry, this is my last question. Why does the administration feel like this should have a different process?
As far as why this is coming in front of you, and I can let Samantha speak to this, but from my perspective, I think the main question in front of you is just, for something that is meant to be very nimble, short-term, temporary, in some cases, we may not even be talking about a full permanent structure. The question is really, should this go through the full conditional use application process if it's meant to be short-term in its nature and ultimately kind of deployed on an emergency basis? So that's the key question.
Okay, thank you.
I think we have Alex and then Bruce.
My question was a process question, which is, if it goes to the DRB for a public hearing, does that mean that the DRB then votes on it? And if they deny the conditional use request, the applicant has to go to what, like the next level, which is environmental court, versus if it comes to planning commission and we say, we don't think we should grant this zoning change, it goes to city council. Is that correct?
No, so in the case of an administrative permit, if something was issued administratively, that actually means that in a project sense, if a project is applied for and approved administratively, that means that it is essentially reviewed and approved at the staff level by Scott Guston or Mary O'Neill or Ryan, the zoning administration team in the permitting and inspections department. If that's denied by the staff, an applicant could appeal it to the Development Review Board and kind of move up the chain from there. If a project is a conditional use and it means it's reviewed by the Development Review Board and the Development Review Board denies it, you're correct that an appeal would actually go outside of the city at that point. It would move up through the e-court process for consideration. The Planning Commission is not considering approving the location of any kind of facility at this point. What you're considering is just whether or not temporary facilities should be allowed to have a different type of permitting process or maintain the existing full conditional use process. And the city council's role in this then is also to just consider whether or not to adopt the same zoning amendment, the same zoning question that you're being asked as well.
Thanks, Megan.
You're welcome.
We have Bruce and then Eves. Bruce?
Megan, since this looks like the substantive difference would be that there are standards that DRB would apply, the conditional use standards, and there are relatively few standards that would be applied administratively because it's hard for an administrator to be stuck in that decision-making process. Basically, if they check the box, it's going to be approved. Can you run through the conditional use standards? So, because I think that's telling about why we do DRB and conditional use.
Give me 1 second and I will pull it up just so that I make sure I don't miss anything. But in a general sense, you know, the conditional use standards are used in order to kind of look at things like, we talk all the time about this sort of ill-defined standard of neighborhood character, but that means a lot of different things in the context of individual projects. But essentially it helps us to look at those. So specifically, our conditional use review process looks at impact on public facilities, character of the area, nuisance impacts, the transportation system's capacity to support the project, the utilization of renewable energy, and then it just says, you know, a catch-all, anything else that is in a city law or ordinance. So those are the things that the Development Review Board would be looking at, and they're not terribly specific. I mean, they say, you know, consider these factors and make sure that this project will not have an undue impact on these standards.
So I think, you know, I think based on that, what we're choosing is between neighbor input and no neighbor input, really. I mean, you have a check the box requirement of the neighborhood planning meeting, but you just have to show up for that. That's the only, there's no decision made. It just has to be a presentation of what you're doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's as far as the process for meeting the standards that are outlined in the table that's proposed would be the ones that would be reviewed. So again, they would look at things like how many people could live at a facility, how long they could stay. There's a requirement that there's an operations and management plan in place that's approved by the city. It would look to make sure that it's a city-owned property or a property that is under an agreement for operation with the city. It would require screening, you know, all those types of things.
So for example, if it were next to a daycare, that wouldn't be a consideration or something.
Not
You know,
an administrative.
Sometimes unintended, we're trying to avoid the unintended consequence, but that's the kind of thing that could happen and an administrative officer wouldn't be able to consider it.
Are you Seppers? Okay. Eves. And then I think we're back to Emily. So Eves.
Well, so I have a question, a couple questions and a couple thoughts. So first of all, if I, and Megan, I think this is a question for you, and if you don't know, just answer, but if I come to you and I say, I want to put up a sign in front of my building, what's the definition of a temporary sign? How long can it be up?
In general, we have temporary standards that are something for less than 30 days. As far as temporary signs, we may have specific standards, but I would need to check that.
So I guess my point is, you know, when you talk about 3 years being temporary, that's not temporary at all. That's relatively permanent. 3 years is a very, very long time. It really is. 3 years ago, we didn't even have the coronavirus, and the world has changed enormously. So I'm frankly reluctant to attach the term temporary to something that's, you know, 3, maybe 5 years. That's relatively permanent, number one. And number two, I guess, you know, what I'd say is, I feel, and I'll say it, everyone's being very polite, and I appreciate that, but in my humble impression, what this strikes me as is a way to avoid the permitting process, to avoid the process that we have in place and that our zoning ordinance requires. And I think what this looks and feels like. And again, to me, and I'm certainly not casting, pointing fingers or anything, but if this were an applicant coming to the city and coming to the public forum, we would say to them, you're trying to circumvent the process. It doesn't work that way. And I guess I would love to hear from anybody how this is not a case of just that. I mean, this is a big deal. And you've heard pretty significant opposition to this from the people who spoke at public forum. We didn't know, we're completely opposed, it doesn't fit in with Plan DBTV. And yet we're trying to avoid the process to see whether this is acceptable or not. And I'm sorry, and perhaps I'm the sole dissenter, but I can't sign off on that. That's not okay. It really isn't. We have a process in place, and yes, it is painful. And I'll be the first one to say, hey, let's make it simpler. But if we make it simpler, it's got to apply to everybody, not just this. And the fact that the pods have been ordered and are being made, and there's a goal to get them in by a certain date, that's not our problem as the Planning Commission. It isn't.
So if sorry.
No, that's it. It's just, again, I feel like you guys are presenting a plan that's, thank you for doing it. And it sounds very nice, but it feels, and, look, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And this feels an awful lot like this is an attempt to address a tiny bit of the concerns that were raised 2 weeks ago, but come back with a way to avoid the process.
So I can speak a little bit just to, how we've addressed different permitting barriers over the last several years, and then I'll let Samantha talk as well about the more specific plans that have been under development. So, I think somebody also said something, or several folks said something about this during the public forum, just about, if we're trying to make the permitting process easier for emergency shelters, we should try to make the permitting process easier for all forms of housing. And I would say that that's been a huge part of the work that you all have been doing as a planning commission for the last several years, definitely 5 years, probably even before I was working with you as well. We've gone through some pretty major zoning reforms together in the last several years with the explicit goal to try to remove barriers to housing creation. So this is another kind of similar effort and we're looking specifically at sort of the most vulnerable form of housing that we have in our city. I was actually just talking with Scott earlier today. We're working on a presentation about some of the zoning changes that we've been working on over the last several years. And I was reminded that, prior to about 2015 time period, housing projects in the downtown would have to go through major impact review process, conditional use review process, just all these sort of layers of zoning review, and changes like the form code. You may remember a few years ago, we actually increased the limits for what's considered a major impact project within the downtown core. So that today, a project like the Nest, the 77 Pine Street building that's going up right now, actually basically was administratively reviewed. That's a 50-unit housing project in downtown that essentially was reviewed as an administrative project. The DRB did look at a very small piece of that project, but otherwise, if it had been 2 stories shorter, the DRB wouldn't have looked at that project at all. And ultimately, that project received a permit in just 3 weeks compared to the 9 months or so that projects used to take in order to get a permit in the city. So I think it's worth just kind of putting in context that a lot of the zoning work that you all have been doing in the last several years has really been intensively focused on trying to remove these barriers to creating housing of all kind. And I see this process as fitting within that kind of body of work that you've been doing. So I don't know, Samantha, if you wanted to add to that.
Thanks, Megan. You did a great job. I just wanted to speak to Eve's comment about that, like an applicant coming in trying to pave the way to make a project simpler. And I that's a valid, you know, experience of what this is. But really what this is the city of Burlington working to address a housing emergency and looking across the country at models that have been effective in being able to bring emergency shelter to those who are currently unhoused more quickly. So this isn't something we've made up. It's based on zoning amendments that have been passed again in cities across the country. And it's proposed, it's, you know, working with the Department of Permitting and, you know, inspections, that department agrees that 36 months is, you know, is a way to think of something as non-permanent. There's not foundations being built. This is not, there's, you know, going through conditional use approval requires landscape planning and what the plants are going to look like in year 5. There's just a very long list of requirements for conditional use approval that really don't apply to something like a temporary emergency shelter. And so I just wanted to reframe that a little bit differently and have it, this zoning amendment is not required for the Elmwood Ave project that I think people have been speaking to move forward. There is definitely a process for it to continue to move forward. And I think regardless of how the commission acts tonight, it's something that should be continued to be considered because it is model zoning that, again, that's been put in place around the country to try to address a housing emergency.
Eves, are you all set? And then Emily has her hand up.
Well, you know, I'm not going to argue. So yeah, I mean, I thank you for that. You know, I'm not sure who it was who said that they have yet to find an example of you know, results being charted. I asked a couple weeks ago, you know, who was going to be managing this. I mean, there's, I from my perspective, and this is only me, I'm not speaking for the commission, this is me, we're rushing this. We're pushing this through as quickly as possible. And yes, we have been trying to simplify the permitting process, and I think that's wonderful. But that's a process. And we have a process, and we're not following the process in this case. It's that simple, for me at least.
Thanks. So I think we have Emily, and then Bruce, I saw your hand go up as well.
I'm recalling the work that we did on form-based code where we changed the process for all of downtown and really pretty much eliminated DRB for almost every project that fit within the form code. But we did have a few things where there was a height, you know, an extra couple stories or something where you would have to go in front of the DRB for specific things. However, we were really thoughtful about what the criteria were that the DRB could weigh in on. Because when I hear, you know, some of the language of the DRB, such as, you know, the character of the neighborhood, a pod city that houses homeless people pretty much doesn't fit into the character of any neighborhood in Burlington. And everybody is going to have a pretty strong case for why it doesn't fit into the character of their neighborhood. So I wonder if we might want to pursue keeping the process, but being very thoughtful about what are the things that are important. Because I'd hate to see a project that we desperately need to deal with a housing crisis go down in flames after a lot of work has gone in by the administration, people who are trying to deal with this housing crisis and house these very vulnerable people because of things such as the character of the neighborhood, or, you know, it needs a dormer instead of a dorm roof instead of a shed roof. If our real concerns are about the maintenance of the property and the supervision and the noise, then maybe those criteria should be things that the DRB can weigh in on.
Yeah, I think that ultimately those are some of the criteria that are part of a conditional use process. We've tried to address some of those concerns through the requirement that an operations and maintenance plan would have to be submitted that would be approved by the city as part of an application for a temporary facility as well. And that would really offer the opportunity for more of the details, the kind of fine-grained details about how a facility is managed in collaboration with its operating partners, and some of the other kind of nuances about operating a shelter of this kind to be considered, where the normal conditional use standards may not actually look all the way deep into those requirements.
We have, Emily, you all set?
Yes, thank you.
So I have Bruce, Michael, and Alex, but I just want to make one comment because I haven't had a chance to speak on this. Just the one issue that keeps popping up for me on this administrative review is mostly it sounds like these are going to be on city property. And so it seems like almost we have a situation where we have a city department wanting to put together this, the pods on city property being reviewed by the city through a process developed by the city and criteria developed by the city. So there's no, like, we don't know what the criteria are. We don't know what the standards are. We don't know, like, you know, it's temporary, but after a year you could renew it, and we don't know what the renewal criteria are. We don't, and it's all being done in essence by the city. So every step of it is being done by the city, and it'd be a lot more comfortable if there were some clear guidelines of not just, you could do it on city property as long as the city says it's okay. Just what are the guidelines? And Emily, I think you pointed out some of them. You know, what are the direct impacts? What are we trying to make sure, you know, doesn't happen or does happen during these things with these? And I'm just not hearing any of that other than, you know, these are city projects that the city decides how to do it from start to finish. That's my take on it for now. So, Bruce?
I think I agree with much of what Emily said and Andy. It feels like there isn't a development of any criteria to evaluate these management plans and to have any consequences when those management plans aren't fulfilled, which might, for example, be revocation of the temporary permit. If it's temporary, it's not a permanent thing. I mean, in other words, I think I could get there, but I would want to be able to attempt to protect our kids walking by in the neighborhood and lots of things like that in order to get to be supportive of this. And I think that's a reasonable request. And right now, I don't think it's even close to acceptable, because the way I see it, if a qualified adult, I don't even know what that means, is managing it, and you can have up to 50 people on 5,000 square feet of land. That's a bigger density requirement than we've ever done, a bigger density allowance. I think the form-based code is highly, highly prescriptive, right down to every little thing that you can do. And in exchange, we get the neighborhood we want. But we also took a very slow incremental approach. We only did this in the downtown. I think the way I read this, maybe some clarification, this could be done anywhere by any landowner, not just the city, right? Megan?
It would either have to be on city-owned property or property that is under an agreement with the city.
Okay. But so my instinct is we could get there if we could get some standards around this that were more applicable. I mean, the reason I raised conditional use and the reason we've waived conditional use is that sometimes it doesn't apply in some circumstances, but I think it wouldn't be hard to come up with some ways of making some standards that are applicable and some enforcement mechanism, since it is temporary and there's not a lot of investment, that would require it to be followed so that the city permitting folks, the zoning folks, had some teeth in what they're doing. Now, it becomes kind of odd because it'd be city enforcing against the city, but there must be some way that the neighbors have a voice if these things turn out to have a heavy negative impact.
Yeah, and Is it okay if I respond, Andy?
Sure.
Maybe more with a question, which is, you know, we've had a lot of conversations in our, you know, work together about how we don't always know what we mean by just saying character of the area or avoiding nuisance impacts. And so sometimes what that means is subjective as part of the process of an individual permit. And I think about in the context of shelters, for example, today, we don't even require something like a management plan. It may be something, maybe something that becomes a condition of a permit after it's gone through a conditional use process. But I think that we're starting to get there in terms of saying that an operations plan would be required up front, that that's just the expectation of getting a permit. I think in order to help kind of understand how this can be developed more fully, I think to Emily and Andy and Bruce's points, I mean, I think it'd be helpful to better understand what are the kinds of standards that you think would be satisfactory to include here. And I asked that kind of understanding that zoning has a specific sort of body of criteria that it is supposed to be looking at. It's not supposed to be about individual tenants' behaviors. It's not supposed to be about who gets to live on a property and who doesn't. So I think in order to have more clearly defined standards that either an administrative process or a more DRB focused process would look at, it'd be helpful to know more about kind of what are those zoning appropriate criteria that you would want to see in here. And that could be a rhetorical question. I think just, you know, kind of thinking.
Bruce, we'll come back to you, but let's keep going around because Michael hasn't spoken yet and Alex still wants. So Michael.
I have two questions, and I apologize if I missed this at the last meeting, but the draft amendment references the CEDO standards for how they'd be set up. And I wondered if just a little, because I think maybe that goes to some of this, just what those might look like. And then related to that, I just want to ask a point of clarification, which is that the proposed pods that have been discussed, it sounds like they necessarily need zoning amendment. I just wanted to make sure that I heard that correctly.
Samantha, do you want to answer both of those questions?
Sure. I think the current, I'll start with the second question. The current project that was approved, the location that was approved by City Council last night, it does not require a zoning amendment to move forward. It requires a zoning permit. So it can be permitted under the existing emergency shelter conditions. And that's the process that project will go through. It needed to get through the approval last night, which allowed city staff to start that permitting process. So, does that answer that question? Okay. And the second one, I think you're referring to, I think I'm looking at the right document that Megan sent, just that in the proposed amendment, there is a operations plan that would be approved by CEDO. And I think what you're saying, like there are not currently an existing set of standards that operations plan would need to go through. And that's something I'm hearing tonight that would be potentially helpful for the committee to know what CEDO was evaluating, because what I've heard Megan say consistently through her experiences, it's not something for zoning, doesn't really have the expertise or the staff. They're just not set up to evaluate things like that. So I think obviously that I don't have a list of requirements right now that I could share. I could share sort of an outline. I did want to share that CEDO just announced we filled the position of a special assistant to end homelessness, which we're very excited to be welcoming Sarah Russell, who has 20 years of experience working on ending homelessness in Burlington. She's going to be bringing her expertise to the city, and she would be the point person in approving those operations plans. And starting soon, I think CEDO could if it was a request of the planning commission, kind of provide a set of guidelines for what would be required to be in the plan and how it would be reviewed. We heard last night about needing to do quarterly reviews and updates on how the community is operating to make sure that it's meeting everyone's needs. And that's something that we anticipate building into the plan. So I don't have one that I can share with you now, but if it's a request of the planning commission, if you think it would be helpful, we can put one together.
Yeah, I do think it's, I mean, I don't know that we necessarily need to see it to stay within confines of what zoning is responsible for, but it would seem that that operations plan would potentially address a lot of this discussion.
Great, thanks. I think we have Alex and then back to you, Bruce.
So I think Samantha answered this question. I had a request for clarification from Samantha and an observation about the whole process. And I think you answered the question. You said this specific project needs a zoning permit, not a zoning change. So, and that was granted. So
the zoning permit has not yet been granted. What Samantha was referring to is that because the proposed location that she will be submitting a permit for is a city-owned parking lot, in order to be able to submit an application, CEDO needed to obtain permission from both the DPW commission and the city council to use that parking lot as the location. So that's what's been approved so far. The zoning permit application has not been submitted yet.
thank you. So the other observation is just that, you know, we've had a homeless problem for a long time. It's difficult, it's intractable, and to fix it, you need to try new things. And this is something I want to approve this project, but I have misgivings about changing our process to do it. And I don't think we should change our process based on who the applicant is, you know, just because the applicant is the city. That's what I'm struggling with. I appreciate the need to, it's like a quick build if you were in public works or something, you know?
Right, exactly.
I want us to,
yeah.
I want us to get there too. And so, you know, I feel like, you know, the homeless are already downtown. That's the, if they're not there now, they're going to be coming back when they're no longer, they're kicked out of their winter shelters at the end of this month, coming up in what, 9 days. They need access to services, which are mostly in the north end of downtown. So those are all things to consider. That's all I got.
Thanks, Bruce.
So Megan, so one of the things I'm trying to resolve is, you know, you generally think of a zoning permit as a permanent vested right. And temporary and vested right don't really fit together very well, in my understanding. Would this essentially terminate after 3 years if it's a temporary application automatically? I guess that's the first question.
That's a great question, Bruce. So, and more specifically, this actually there is language on page 3 that actually says that the permit would be required to be renewed every single year for a maximum of 3 years. And beyond 3 years, a permanent facility permit would need to be obtained. So the question that you're asking about automatic expiration essentially is a good one. This would have to be addressed in terms of the permit's applicability date. And your specific question is actually a very good one. I could follow up with Scott to just make sure that we don't need to, you know, write anything into the section of the ordinance that talks about the applicability of permits to address that. But the intention here is that it would need to be actively renewed on an annual basis for up to 3 years.
And would that review include a performance review? You know, how has the neighborhood been impacted? Or no review at all? If you reapply and check the boxes for administrative approval, you get it, regardless of what's occurred?
What's in front of you right now does not specify that there would have to be a report on performance. I think if CEDO, you know, included that in what an operations plan, you know, that any changes to the operations plan need to address kind of the past year's performance. I think that review could be addressed, but this does not specifically ask for that kind of retroactive review.
Anyone else? So where do people want to go with this for tonight? Eves, is your hand up? I see a hand, but I'm not sure if it's just from leftover.
Oh, I think Eves,
Can you just drop off?
you asked about his hand and he completely left. Oh, sorry. I also see there's a hand here from Brian Pine. I don't know if he's still here.
Oh, Brian. Yes.
Brian Pine, are you still?
Brian, are you looking to speak?
I did not have anything particular to say except to point out that the request that is before you is really in recognition of a pressing public policy, as opposed to the notion that this is somehow seeking favoritism for a particular developer. So I think the notion of a public purpose objective that is trying to meet an urgent need is really not synonymous with someone who is seeking to develop a property for their own purposes even, but in fact, this is for the public good. When you're doing a public good, I think there are other examples. The federal government doesn't come to the DRB for permits. There's other government entities that actually get to, and there's even railroads, and there's other entities that serve a public purpose. And I think that's being lost in this discussion is for a public purpose entity that is meeting an urgent public need, I think it should not be viewed the same as a private developer. That's it.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point that Brian raises as well. I know there are certain public purposes that are addressed similarly under the state statute. Schools, for example, are one of them where municipal zoning review can be limited by the state statute for the purpose of providing a public school, for example. Sorry.
So where does the commission want to go with this? We've had a lot of
Hey, Andy,
discussion on it.
I've got my hand raised. Can I make one comment?
Yes.
You know, just this is directed at what Brian just said. That's completely understandable. But you speak about the public quite a bit. If this is going to move forward, the public needs to be aware and be able to weigh in, and it needs to go through the process that allows that. And this does not allow for that. And that's the whole thing, is that, you know, you don't get to just do things no matter what. You know, it might be very important to put a roof on your house, but you don't get to put it on like the next day. It doesn't work that way. And this is something very significant. The reason we have a process is to review things that are important to the community and allow the community to weigh in. That's not saying it shouldn't happen. What that's saying is there's a process, and the process is there for a reason, which is to allow the public to weigh in, ask questions, perhaps look for conditions and answers. So, you know, you're right. This is very different than somebody coming to look and build a, 100-unit building. Well, that process is going to take 3 years. We're not asking for that. But what we are asking is that there be a process, and the process, the city, follow its own rules.
Actually, I have a question on the current proposal, the one on Elmwood Ave. What is that going through? If it seems like it doesn't need the process, the zoning change that we're being asked of. So there's obviously something in place that allows that to go forward. What's that? How's that going forward?
The existing zoning regulations, it can be permitted as an emergency shelter, conditional use under the existing zoning regulations. So it can move forward with a permit application, a conditional use application through the existing zoning regulations.
So why isn't that sufficient? Why does a new process need to be done?
Again, I think we're just talking about in the future for facilities that are meant to be temporary and interim, to be able to be deployed quickly and maybe for short periods of time, that full conditional use process, even though this project in particular intends to submit an application under it, may not be the best way for us to address this kind of emergency housing need, especially on a short-term basis.
Okay, thanks. Michael?
Yeah, my comment was actually very similar to you, Andy. I think the need is obvious. The source of funding for this one that is topical is present, and it's meant to address problems laid bare by the coronavirus. But I was a contradiction a bit in creating a permanent structure for a temporary solution. Particularly since we have a path forward, one that actually has funding and that will serve the immediate need. I guess just I can't help but play devil's advocate and think that, well, if we're looking to make something permanent, what we should really be doing is thinking about ways to make it permanently possible to, develop a shelter structure that has more permanence than a temporary structure, and that won't face the possibility of eviction or tear down after a short period of time. And so, I don't really necessarily agree with these process discussions, because I think those are just a way of avoiding the subject by a different means. But I do wonder if there is, from just a policy perspective, an argument against doing this, just because we have a board to serve the immediate need, and what we really should be doing is focusing on ways to make this permanent. To not do something that is so temporary if we're going to spend all the time doing it. So that's a bit of an anvil in the conversation, but I just have trouble going through all this trouble to do something that's ultimately temporary and doesn't really get at the end problem, given that and I would, if it were not for the fact that we had a way forward for what's being discussed with the ARPA dollars.
Anyone else? Thank you, Michael. Emily?
I just have to agree with what Michael's saying. That's something that struck me when I was reviewing this and having conversations with people about this. I served on the Lund board for 9 years, and I was the board president. These are really difficult problems to solve, and they take multifaceted solutions. It's not just about providing housing. It's like programs like what Lund does. It's programs like Cathedral Square, which is an incredible place for people to live, where they have so many different services coming in and handling really complex situations, that I come back to what Michael says and thinks, geez, how many permanent housing, in a model like that could we create with the money that we're spending on this temporary housing? And is temporary housing, I feel like it's a humanitarian thing to do, to keep people from literally dying on the street. But the real solution is a lot bigger than that, and creating these housing systems that really support people in many different ways, to lift them out of poverty and out of mental health and health crises permanently.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't know if Samantha or Brian want to speak to this more fully, but I think ultimately the city does have an interest in creating permanent housing options for people who are experiencing homelessness or housing vulnerability. But we also know that, kind of like all forms of housing, when we're talking about housing for vulnerable members of our community, we also need a range of options too. And so again, the concept of having something that specifically creates a process to roll out temporary emergency shelter options within the kind of ladder of supportive housing is what we were trying to get at here. We already have a process in place for permanent shelter facilities. We're trying to make progress on expanding the availability of permanent affordable housing that accommodates folks who have previously experienced homelessness. You know, we're trying all the way up the ladder. I think the most critical piece that we're really missing is both the physical infrastructure and a process that helps us really quickly deploy the most quick and temporary kind of housing in the most urgent situations. And so that's what this was really trying to help us address, like all the way on that end for when we need it, as we're trying to build all the options up the ladder as well.
I can respond quickly, and I don't want to
Michael?
take away from everything else that's going on, Megan, understanding that, you know, everyone's fighting this on multiple fronts. I just wonder if the temporary solution will always be the most expedient solution. And in this current moment, I support the pods. I support the pods, but I feel like there's a way forward for those in the interim. And so if we're doing something that's meant to be longer lived, then I'm just not sure that this is necessarily the approach, because presumably if we get to that, you know, if we have some, you know, another crisis 6 years down the line when this comes into play, then the same sort of, you know, the same process that's going on now for the pods will take place also. I don't know. I can't help but think that it just, I'm just not sure, I suppose.
Bruce?
Just a quick comment. I don't, you know, we're using the word temporary, but if it's renewable every 3 years without, at least as written, without standards, then it's really permanent. Or to the extent that the landowner wants to keep it going. So, I mean, I think if we could put maybe some meaning to the word temporary, it might be helpful to move it forward. And Andy asked the question, you know, what's your pleasure? And maybe I'll just jump in. I mean, I think we need more discussion around how it could work to protect the community. And, you know, a win-win obviously would be a path forward to have it happen, but to protect the community as well. You know, I agree with Brian that this is a public benefit, but it's not a public benefit without cost to many of us in the public. So I think it's an appropriate, that process is an appropriate conversation to be had. But if it's not process, at least there has to be substance attached to the word temporary and what makes it what seems to be a long-term right. But so what I would propose is that we have another hearing on this and hear more about what kinds of standards we could have to protect the public and what consequences for failure to adhere to those standards might be. It's one thing to have them, but if there's nothing in the ordinance to say what the result of not fulfilling those standards is, then it's really not meaningful.
I might suggest also that if the whole concept of this is of what we're looking at is a quick temporary solution, you know, quick solution for temporary need, to really build in the temporariness of it. You know, if it's a longer solution, the process that we have right in place right now works for the longer solution. This is one that's really trying to get at, we have an immediate need right now that needs to be addressed. And just allowing that to go on for an extended period of time just seems to be, well, that's not the immediacy. You know, that's going back to the structure that we have in place. Alex?
That's what I was going to ask Bruce and you, Andy, was, you know, do you feel like you could support this if it had some standards attached to it and had a shorter term or time limit? Like, you know, if it's, and what do you think? Sounds like what you're asking for.
You're asking me?
Both of you.
Yeah, I think I could. I think we'd have to develop some standards around what could work so we can avoid some unintended consequence that you know, sometimes we're moving in one direction and other things occur. We also should, hear about what's happening in other communities that have adopted this, how long they've had them in place for, what the benefits and detriments associated with it. I don't know of any decision that doesn't have a detriment to it. Doesn't mean you don't do it, but everything has a consequence that is positive and negative. And part of what I'm trying to evaluate here is to balance the positives and the negatives and not ignore what may be negatives as well. So yes, long-winded way of saying I could, but I need to hear more and have more meaningful input from those that have done this before, what the consequences of it are, and how we have an impact on this problem. Sometimes we solve a problem and think we've solved it. We do something and think we've solved the problem and we haven't provided a solution. Maybe that's more toward Emily's point of there needs to be a lot more than just the structure, although the structure is helpful. So
I mean, yeah, there's plenty of history of that in the United States of, like, putting poor people in housing projects, see how well that worked. I think Samantha helped by explaining that, we should stop thinking about Elmwood Avenue and just, this is about a larger process issue. And I was trying to think if, what if we weren't talking about housing the homeless, but we were talking about an emergency shelter, for anybody. And like, what if, an entire neighborhood, forest fires are increasingly common. What if we lost like Bayberry Commons or something, a couple hundred people lost their housing overnight, where would we put them? Probably in hotels, but like, maybe we should continue to think about this in terms of the homeless, because it's a they're people, and if they're people, they're deserving of our respect. And if you give them a place to live and access to services, then they can start to turn their lives around. And it's only a small subset of them that are responsible for the public nuisances and things that we associate, the negative behaviors we associate with them. So
well, I think you're right. I think you're right, Alex. But if we're trying to solve a narrow problem, we try to narrowly focus the solution. And this is a broad brush, I think, to a narrow, it's not temporary the way it's written, in my view. Yet we're saying we're trying to solve that sort of exigency you raise, a temporary problem. It feels like, at least the way it's written, it's a long-term ordinance as far as I'm concerned. This gets renewed.
Mm-hmm.
It's a permanent site, I believe, in practicality.
It's not meant to be, so we can address that point. I mean, the intention here was that as a temporary site, it would be renewed on an annual basis and no more than for 3 years. And beyond that, if it were to exist for more than 3 years, it would have to be reviewed under our current, permanent emergency shelter standards. So as I mentioned before, we'll come back to just make sure that there's not other pieces of language that need to be tied to that, but the intention was not for this to operate as a permanent kind of solution.
Why not something like this then? And I'm just throwing this out there. I haven't really thought it through enough, obviously, but why does it need to be renewed? Why not just say we have an emergency need, a temporary need, and so we want to be able to do a quickly allow the site to go up. During that process, though, they have to apply for if they want to keep it there for a longer term. There is no renewal. You just have to apply for the permit and go through the regular permit process, and it either works or it doesn't work. But there's no need. The temporary is getting it up and started, because the permitting process may take too long. So that way you avoid the permitting process to get it started. Now you have to go through it. So for it to continue there, it has to go through that process. Something like that is an idea.
Yeah, I think there could be a challenge to that in terms of, in order to get something stood up, there's still an investment of costs and resources. And if the application ultimately is not successful, then that could result in the immediate removal. So I think we want to, if we are interested in the idea of some kind of a temporary a process for temporary structures, we should just be clear about what that process actually is.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good idea, but I worry about the kind of unintended consequences of that.
So it sounds like our desire is to have Megan, Samantha, and the others take, look into this further. There've been a lot of questions, issues, concerns that have been raised. See if some of those could start getting addressed, and then have it come back to us. Is that basically the consensus of the commission? Okay. Good. Anything else before we close this out?
As the person that would be responding to the Planning Commission's concerns and requests for additional information, it would be really helpful for me to understand what kind of information would be helpful for moving forward. I've heard a lot of different things, and so, so it would be helpful to know from the Planning Commission what you're looking for in addition to what Megan has presented.
I think what you're hearing are the concerns of that there are no real standards put in place. So that way, when you're looking at renewal, it could be it could be a great project and may not meet some standard, and so it doesn't continue, or it may be one that's causing just lots of disruptions in the area and could continue for 3 years pretty much unabated. This is all designed to be a temporary, and yet it could go to 3 years, which seems not just temporary. There's just no understanding of what kind of oversight there is. There's no understanding, like when you look at the homeless issue, it's often not just that somebody doesn't have a home, but there are root causes to that. Not always, but for many, and that doesn't seem like there's anything in place that will help to move people beyond just being homeless. That there's no support systems that are necessarily in place with this. I think we've heard a whole host of different concerns from the various planning commissioners, and I don't know that we have, as a commission, I don't think well, obviously we haven't voted to say, these are our list of concerns. I don't think that we're even there yet to be able to do that, but so I've outlined a variety of them. I don't know if I've hit on all the ones that were talked about, but are there any key ones that I'm missing that, Michael?
Out the O&M plan would be helpful.
Could you say that once more? You broke up just a little bit.
The operation and management plan.
Yeah.
Kind of fleshing that out, what CEDO intends by that, because some of those will address topics raised.
Good. Okay. Anything else that I missed? All right, great.
Okay.
Good. All right, then we will close out this item and move to, so thank you, and we look forward to further discussion on this. It's obviously is a big topic and an important topic for us and for the city. So then we'll move on to item
Andy?
6, which are, yes.
I'm sorry, I think Brian Pine has his hand up. I don't know if he still wants to talk.
Brian, did you want to speak, or is that your hand just continued?
I think it may in fact be redundant, but I just want to point out that please don't view the proposal and the plan for shelter pods as the city's response to the housing crisis overall. It is not the plan to attempt to address long-term needs with the shelter pods, and the shelter pods are part of a comprehensive plan around homelessness, but should not be viewed as the only policy or financial response to the housing crisis. I heard that mentioned a couple of times. I just want to be clear that it is part of, and it is perhaps the lowest rung on the ladder, but we're working on every rung on that ladder. And I just want to reiterate that this is just one piece of that, and it's an essential piece to address emergency needs that really have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And it's really uniquely, the conditions have gotten significantly worse during the pandemic. And so we're trying to help ensure a just recovery from the pandemic. This is not a long-term solution. It is really intended to be just that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So we'll close out this item and move on to item 6, which are commissioner items. Our next meetings are April 12th and April 26th. Are there any other commissioner items? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to item 7, which are minutes and communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept communications? Motion by Alex, seconded by Emily. Any discussion? All those in favor of the motion?
Andy, just one note, there was an additional communication that you received yesterday, has been posted online. It's a notice of a public hearing from the city of South Burlington about amending their official map. So you're always notified when any of our municipal neighbors change their zoning ordinance. So just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that that one came in yesterday and has been posted.
Great, thank you. All those in favor of the motion, say aye or raise your hand. Aye. Any opposed? That's unanimous. And then item 8 is adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn? Motion by Michael, seconded by Emily. All in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
We stand adjourned. Thank you all. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.